He stood up, and a hush fell over the room. He walked to the podium, took the memo from Clara's hand, and looked at it. Then he looked at the commission chair. Vance Acquisitions withdraws its proposal for the redevelopment of the Heritage Block, effective immediately. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't deliver a grand, redemptive speech. He simply stated a new fact and walked out of the room, leaving chaos and stunned silence in his wake. To understand how a ruthless real estate mogul could surrender in his moment of victory, you have to understand the woman and the simple bowl of soup that laid the foundation for his defeat. Alistair Vance operated on a simple, brutal principle. The past was a liability. From his office on the 40th floor, a sterile sanctuary of glass and muted gray, he viewed the city below not as a tapestry of human lives, but as a chessboard of undervalued assets waiting to be liquidated. His latest move, the acquisition of the 3-square-block parcel designated Heritage Block, was nearly complete. The preliminary zoning report is in, his junior executive Davies said, his voice betraying a hint of trepidation. There's considerable pushback on the displacement of the legacy businesses, specifically a restaurant called the Gilded Spoon. Alistair didn't look up from the architectural model of the Vance Citadel that would soon occupy the space. Pushback is the cost of doing business, Davies. Factor it into the miscellaneous expenses. Are the demolition permits filed? Yes, sir, but the city mandates a 60-day public comment period and a final hearing. The community coalition is surprisingly organized. Alistair finally met his gaze, his eyes devoid of warmth. Then we'll manage them. Sentiment doesn't survive a cost-benefit analysis. For Alistair, this was an immutable law of nature. Down in the heart of the Heritage Block, inside the warm, amber-lit walls of the Gilded Spoon, Clara Romano felt the weight of 60 years of history settle on her shoulders. At 29, she was the reluctant curator of her father's dream, a promise made at his bedside that now felt more like a sentence. She loved the place, but some days, the love was suffocating. The air thick with the scent of garlic and her father's signature ragu was also heavy with the odor of decay. The leaky faucet in the men's room, the peeling varnish on booth number 7, the dwindling reservations in her logbook. Sometimes, in the dead quiet of a Tuesday afternoon, a treacherous thought would surface. Sell it. Just sell it and be free. The guilt that followed was always immediate and crushing. She'd look at the portrait of her father, Leo, his broad, flower-dusted smile beaming from behind the bar, and the thought would retreat, banished to the dark corners of her mind. The official notice of the public hearing, taped to the front window by a city official, turned her abstract dread into a cold, hard reality. It wasn't just a foreclosure notice from the bank anymore. It was an execution order signed by Vance Acquisitions. Staring at the sterile font, a fire she hadn't felt in years began to burn through her exhaustion. That evening, she didn't just serve her regulars, she rallied them. Mrs. Gable, a widow who'd had her first date with her late husband in booth number 4. Mr. Henderson, a retired postal worker who claimed Leo's gnocchi had restorative properties. They became the first members of the Save the Spoon coalition. Alistair attended the first community meeting in the basement of the local library, viewing it as a perfunctory and slightly distasteful obligation. He expected a handful of tearful, incoherent speeches he could easily dismantle with logic and projections of economic growth. He was not prepared for Clara Romano. She stood at the flimsy podium, not with tears, but with a binder thick with documents and a voice that trembled only slightly before finding its strength. She didn't just talk about memories. She talked about the restaurant's role as a community anchor, its local supply chain, the 16 people it employed. She presented signed petitions and letters from 3 generations of patrons. She made a powerful, articulate case for cultural value over market value. Mr. Vance sees a block of outdated buildings, she concluded, her eyes finding his in the back of the room. We see a neighborhood, and a neighborhood is not for sale. Annoyed by her poise and the crowd's supportive murmurs, Alistair took the floor. He didn't bother with the microphone. Your sentiment is admirable, he said, his voice cutting through the room's warmth, but it's fiscally irresponsible. Progress has a price. This city needs jobs and growth, not a museum to nostalgia that, by your own admission, is failing. He gestured toward her. You can't pay your bills with memories. The comment was a calculated, cruel strike, and it landed with the force of a slap. But instead of silencing her, it galvanized the room. He had shown his hand. He wasn't a builder. He was a destroyer. He left the meeting having turned a small brush fire into a raging inferno, with Clara Romano standing firmly at its center. Over the next month, the conflict escalated. The Save the Spoon coalition became a local media darling. Alistair's usual tactics, legal intimidation, backroom deals with city officials, were met with surprising resistance, expertly countered by a pro bono lawyer Clara had found. The bad press was starting to spook Alistair's board. This is becoming a PR nightmare, his chief counsel warned. You need to neutralize the narrative. You need to neutralize her. Alistair decided on a direct approach. He walked into the Gilded Spoon on a quiet afternoon and made Clara an offer that would solve all her problems. He named a figure that made her breath catch, enough to pay off the restaurant's debt, renovate it completely, and live comfortably for years. Take the money, he said, his tone suggesting it was a foregone conclusion. It's a logical solution for everyone. Clara stared at him, a slow burning anger replacing her shock. My father's life's work isn't a line item for you to acquire, Mr. Vance. This restaurant isn't for sale. Now, if you're not going to order, I'd like you to leave. Her rejection baffled him. It was illogical, defeated by emotion. To understand the enemy, he realized he had to study it. He began to frequent the Gilded Spoon, sitting at a back table under the guise of market research. He'd nurse a single cup of coffee for hours, observing. The interactions were tense and clipped. He'd make comments about the inefficient layout of the kitchen. She'd retort with a jab about his soulless architecture. You could increase table turnover by 15% if you arranged the booths in a grid system, he remarked one evening, gesturing with a pen. I'm running a restaurant, not a human processing plant, she shot back without breaking stride. He started to see the data he couldn't quantify. He saw Mrs. Gable sit at her usual table, talking quietly to the empty chair across from her. He saw Clara give a free meal to a young, struggling musician. He saw the easy camaraderie between the staff and the regulars. It was an ecosystem, inefficient and messy, but stubbornly alive. It irritated him. It made no sense. One particularly grueling Tuesday, after a disastrous meeting with the bank and a heated argument with her produce supplier, Clara felt herself start to fray. The restaurant was empty, the silence amplifying her sense of failure. On the verge of tears, she retreated to the kitchen. Forgoing her father's complex recipes, she reached for the simplest ingredients she could find. A few forgotten potatoes, an onion, a handful of carrots. She began to cook, not for a customer, but for herself. It was peasant soup, a simple, rustic dish her father used to make when she was sick, a recipe born of poverty and love. The rhythmic chopping of the vegetables, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen, was a meditation. When the soup was done, she turned to see Alistair, still at his table, his laptop open, the blue light illuminating his focused scowl. He had stayed through the dinner hour, an unnerving, silent observer. For a reason she couldn't fathom, pity perhaps, or a flicker of shared exhaustion, she ladled a second bowl and placed it on his table without a word. I'm not hungry, he said dismissively, not looking up. I didn't ask if you were, she replied, walking away. He stared at the bowl for a long moment, annoyed by the gesture. He picked up the spoon, intending to leave it untouched. But the steam carried a scent, time, and something else. Something deep and earthy that snagged on a forgotten corner of his mind. He took a reluctant spoonful. The taste did not inspire a sudden, dramatic epiphany. There was no cinematic flashback. Instead, it was a quiet, unsettling disturbance, like a phantom limb beginning to ache. A confusing echo of a memory, too distant to grasp, of a similar warmth in a much colder room. It was a feeling, not a thought, and it left him profoundly unnerved. He didn't understand it, and Alistair Vance despised things he couldn't understand. He left the restaurant that night feeling a crack in the foundation of his own certainty. The soup became an obsession. He returned to the restaurant, his questions changing. He no longer talked about efficiency. "What was in that soup?" he asked, his tone less demanding, more curious. "Potatoes, onions, whatever was left in the pantry," Clara said, wiping down the counter. "It's not on the menu." He started asking about her father, about the stories behind the dishes. He listened as she told him about Leo's disastrous first attempt at making pasta, the story behind the cracked plate displayed in a cabinet, a relic from the night her parents got engaged in the restaurant. Each story was a small, quiet act of resistance, a piece of the heritage he had tried to dismiss. Slowly, reluctantly, he began to share fragments of his own story. He told her about his father, a man with a heart bigger than his business sense, who lost everything by extending credit to friends and refusing to lay off loyal but unproductive staff. "I watched his kindness bankrupt us," Alistair confessed one evening, staring into his coffee. "I built my entire life on one principle: never let sentiment dictate a business decision." He looked at her, his expression unguarded for the first time. "I'm beginning to question the integrity of that principle." It was in that moment of shared vulnerability that Davies, Alistair's junior executive, made a choice. Wrestling with his conscience, he anonymously slipped an envelope under the Gilded Spoon's door. Inside was a copy of an internal memo detailing Vance acquisition strategy to use an obscure zoning loophole to bypass the final planning commission hearing and begin demolition immediately. Clara felt a surge of cold fury, but also a strange pang of disappointment. After all those conversations, after that flicker of humanity she had seen in him, this was his endgame. A lie. The day of the final hearing arrived. The room was packed. The commission chair, swayed by Alistair's influence, was ready to approve the motion. Just as Vance's lawyer stood up to invoke the loophole, Clara approached the podium. Assertively, "Before you proceed," she said, her voice ringing with clarity, "serious, I believe the commission should be aware of Mr. Vance's true intentions." She held up the memo, indignant. "This isn't about progress. It's about bad faith dealings designed to silence the voice of this community." The room erupted. The media, present in full force, began scribbling furiously. Alistair's lawyer looked at him, waiting for the command to attack, to discredit the document. But Alistair was looking at Clara, at the righteous anger in her eyes. He saw the faces of Mrs. Gable and Mr. Henderson in the front row. He thought of the phantom taste of that soup. He stood up, and a hush fell over the room. He walked to the podium, took the memo from Clara's hand, and looked at it. Then he looked at the commission chair. Resolutely, Vance Acquisitions withdraws its proposal for the redevelopment of the Heritage Block. Firmly, effective immediately. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't deliver a grand redemptive speech. He simply stated a new fact and walked out of the room, leaving chaos and stunned silence in his wake. The aftermath was messy. Alistair's board was apoplectic. The media speculated wildly about his motives, and the community, while victorious, remained deeply suspicious. Clara, more than anyone, felt adrift in the shock of it all. A week later, Alistair approached her, not with a check or an apology, but with a business prospectus. It was a detailed plan for a partnership. He would provide the capital to renovate the Gilded Spoon and the business expertise to make it profitable and sustainable. In return, he wanted to be a silent partner, with Clara retaining full control over the restaurant's soul. "Consider it an investment," he said, avoiding her gaze. "My portfolio is lacking in tangible assets." Clara was wary. "Why should I trust you?" "You probably shouldn't," he admitted, "but the numbers in this plan are sound, and my name isn't on the deed. It's a 5-year plan to make this place self-sufficient. After that, you can tell me to get lost." They argued for weeks about the budget, about the new menu items she wanted to add, about his insistence on a modern point-of-sale system. It was a negotiation, fraught with tension and distrust, but it was honest. Slowly, a new foundation was built. The final scene took place 9 months later. The Gilded Spoon was not reborn, it was renewed. The renovation had preserved the worn wooden floors and the gallery of faded photographs, but the kitchen was modern, the plumbing worked, and every table was full. Alistair sat in booth number 7, a laptop open in front of him, arguing with a contractor over the cost of sourcing reclaimed oak for the new bar. He was wearing a casual sweater, not a suit, and he looked tired. but content. Clara slid a bowl onto the table in front of him. Peasant soup. He looked up at her, a small, genuine smile forming. Is this a bribe? No, she said, her own smile finally reaching her eyes. It's a staff meal. You're a partner, remember? He picked up the spoon. The work wasn't over. The trust wasn't absolute. The future was uncertain. But as he tasted the soup, he recognized the flavor not of a forgotten past, but of a difficult, hopeful, and authentic present. It was the taste of a foundation being laid, one humble ingredient at a time.